Hey everybody, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and resident YouTube short hater, Blunchley. In today's episode, we ask a question that's incredibly fundamental to local politics and the Localist project as a whole. Who actually votes in local elections? Now that we've recovered from the hostile centralism podcast takeover from April Fools, we're back to our regularly scheduled Localism programming. The question of who votes in local elections will, as we'll see, have answers that are a combination of surprising, depressing, and highly revealing. It'll also give us a chance to revisit a piece of the localism political prescription that sometimes gets short shrift, which is my fault. The idea that in addition to devolving more power to local governments, we need to reform the way those local governments operate to ensure direct rule by us, the people, rather than embedded political or financial interests. This is the proxy-based direct democracy system we've discussed in the past, and in fact did a whole episode on several months ago. It's episode 6 if you want to go back and give yourself a refresher on the concepts. The idea of proxy-based direct democracy is that it tries to capture the benefits of direct democracy while minimizing the practical downsides of actually implementing direct democracy in a town or city with potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And mitigating those downsides is important. The logistics of getting a bunch of citizens into a room together to vote don't just present practical issues, they also can potentially raise questions of equity and justice, because to participate in traditional direct democracy, you have to have the time and the capacity to sit in legislative meetings for hours on end, and do that quite often. If it turns out that there are only certain people in a community who have that time and capacity, then traditional direct democracy may actually favor a privileged minority rather than the community as a whole. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's roll the intro, and I'll see you in a few. Alright, for now, let's throw all that proxy-based direct democracy shit right out the window, at least for a bit. I just want to ask a pretty simple question. Local elections are a thing pretty much no matter where you live in America. And even though they might not get as much coverage as the headline-grabbing state or national elections, arguably the local elections are far more impactful to your daily life. Your mayor, county commissioner, school board member, or alderman keeps your local infrastructure in good repair. They shape your built environment by deciding what buildings can or can't be built. They manage the schools that are charged with educating and protecting your children. They set the pay and working conditions for the teachers, garbage men, paramedics, cops, firefighters, and street cleaners who keep your community safe and in good condition. Truly, when it comes to who is making the day-to-day decisions with the most serious consequences for you personally, it, more often than not, is probably your local politicians. And crucially, in a lot or even maybe most communities, your vote and participation in local elections can actually represent an exercise of great political agency. Pretty much nobody listening to this podcast, including me, really has any say in who actually becomes governor or president. In our system where we cram so many people together and have them scrap it out over whose butts sit in what state or federal capitals that likely are hundreds or thousands of miles away from where you live, who wins presidential and gubernatorial elections is determined by a nasty cocktail of political expenditures, big party politics, and good old ruthless disregard for the well-being of others. Then the winners trot off to their distant capitals and put as much distance between themselves and their constituents as possible. In comparison, when you Pokemon go to the polls for your local elections, the only people who get a say are you and your neighbors and your fellow community members. It's your voices that decide the day. Not the voices of the people from that place 2 towns over that you hate, or some stranger from halfway across the country who hates your guts and your way of life, or a smoky backroom type. Nope, just a shared body of people with a shared body of concerns, problems, beliefs, arguments, grudges, and experiences. In short, a community. And once that election does happen, the local politician doesn't get to scuttle off to DC to hang out with the bigwigs and lobbyists in expensive bars. No, the local politician has to stay with the people who elected him. And while you can make calls and write letters to your congressman until your face turns blue for his legislative aides to throw right into the trash, you can actually just go to a city council meeting and speak directly to your local politicians about what's on your mind. And they kind of have to care about what you say and what you think, because if they don't, you won't vote for them again. And unlike a politician at a different level of government, they can't just ignore you because they've already won over a bigger city elsewhere in the state or whatever. Anyway, point is, local elections are super fucking important and have a lot of opportunity for you to express your values and preferences via genuine political agency. This position of mine is not news to anybody who has been listening to us for a long time. So because they are so important and so empowering, especially compared to fuck-ass compromise state or federal elections, you might expect that people would be excited to participate in them. And you, unfortunately, would be dead wrong. I'm about to throw some numbers at you, but before I do, I just want to flag that a lot of the info from this episode is going to come from Professor Barry's fascinating article, The Timing of Local Elections, which I'll be sure to link in the description/show notes depending on what platform you're listening on. As we'll see, Professor Barry and I are in full agreement regarding the problems surrounding local political participation, but I think he and I reach very different conclusions about what solution to pursue. So how bad is participation in local elections? Answer: bad. Probably worse than you think. For mayoral elections, which tend to be the biggest and flashiest kind of local elections that draw the most engagement, average voter participation in America is a pretty anemic 20%. For comparison, in 2024, voter participation for the presidential election was 64%, and voter participation for the 2022 midterms was 46%. So already we only have 1 in 5 total eligible voters making it out to vote for mayor, which is less than half of the number of people who go out and vote in federal elections. But the story just gets worse for other local elections that don't feature quite as flashy of positions. As Professor Barry explains in his article, it's tougher to find data on this issue, but the tentative assumption is that participation in races for things like school board or planning commission ranges between 5 to 15%. In one very salient case cited by Professor Barry, turnout in local elections in, oh god, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, I'm not from New York, Nassau County, New York, was often less than 5%, despite the fact that the people who lived there had a 44% voter turnout in a gubernatorial election that very same year. That data is particularly fascinating. It isn't that the people who live in Nassau County just don't care about politics. That's clearly not the case. They were willing to turn up in pretty impressive numbers in order to decide who the New York governor would be. But something about local elections just made it not worth the trek out. To figure out what's making people not want to vote in local elections, we could maybe start by taking a look at who is voting in them. Who are these 10 to 20% of people in the average community who buck the trend and cast votes for county commissioner or another local position? As it turns out, we do actually have some answers for this question. There are 3 main ways that people who vote in local elections are likely to differ from those who do not. I'm just going to quote directly from Professor Barry because he's a much better writer than me, and why work when I can just steal? Quote, "First, voters in local elections are less racially diverse than the electorate overall. White voters are significantly more likely to vote in local elections than are non-white voters. Latinos and Asian Americans are especially underrepresented among local voters. Second, voters are more affluent than non-voters. Voters have notably higher incomes and higher education levels than non-voters, while the gap between unemployed and full-time workers is especially large. Finally, voters are older than non-voters. Voters over the age of 65 are the most overrepresented group in local elections. They cast ballots at 2 to 5 times the rate of voters aged 18 to 34, resulting in an average gap of 15 years between the median age of voters and the median age of the voting eligible population." So hey, there we go. Question in the podcast title answered. Who votes in local elections? Old rich white people. Obviously, this isn't universally true everywhere in America, but it is true in a lot of places. Anecdotally, I know it's damn true where I live. Whenever I go to vote in a local election, I look up and down the line, and I'd place the average age at maybe 65, and I see a lot of white faces just like mine, despite living in a pretty racially diverse place. My guess is that if any of you listening to this podcast are also participants in a local elections, you see a lot of the same things. And if you've ever been to a city council meeting, oof, it's just the same. Rich retirees abound. And here's something I want to drive home. Trends like this aren't just a curiosity. They have serious consequences for what happens in your local government. If the only people who are voting in local elections are rich old white people, then local politicians are going to understand that their careers live or die on whether those rich old folks are kept happy. Take my favorite hobby horse, affordable housing. You know who tends to want and need affordable housing? Not rich people, that's for sure. Quite the opposite. Wealthier homeowners are the ones most likely to go out and complain about affordable housing and try to stop it from happening because, from their perspective, they have to bear the negative externalities that affordable housing can create, and this group sees none of its benefits. And so a lot of affordable housing simply dies on the vine at the approval stage of local governments, even if all the local politicians give lip service to affordability. Those local politicians understand that affordable housing is good for a locality as a whole, but they oppose it anyway because while it might be good for the community as a whole, it isn't good for the part of the community that put and keeps them in office. So yeah, trends have a lot of power in politics. At this point, we've answered the question of who actually votes in local elections. Now it's time for the harder questions. Why is it the case that we can see these really low turnouts? Why is it that certain people are more likely to vote in local elections than others? And what should we do about it? To just get out ahead of this, it definitely is not the case that rich old white people are just more enlightened and more understanding of how important local governments are than other groups. That's really stupid. Clearly, everybody is capable of understanding that local government stuff is important and that we should participate in local elections and political processes to the extent that we can. The answer must lie in something else, some capability or convenience that this group of older and more wealthy folks have that maybe younger or less wealthy folks do not. So here's what Professor Barry suggests. His argument is that the reason why people don't turn out to local elections is because it's inconvenient to have to go to local elections in addition to the federal ones, and therefore the best way to make sure that people participate in local elections is to change when we hold them. To Professor Barry, we could solve our engagement problems by having local elections be held on the same day as the big-time federal or state elections. The theory here is that voters will adopt the attitude of, well, I'm in the neighborhood anyway, so I might as well cast votes for all the local stuff that's on the ballot too. He points to studies reflecting that when you shift local elections so that they fall on the same day as big-ticket federal and state elections, not only does turnout markedly improve, voters who cast ballots are more likely to have demographics that align with their communities rather than just being old, rich white people. And that makes sense, right? Rich retirees have literally the most time on their hands of any population groups except children, and children can't vote. It's much easier for a rich retiree to fit a trip to the polls into their day than, say, someone with less money who can't afford to take leave to go vote during working hours, or a full-time parent with new kids in the home, or pretty much anybody else who has a lot of shit to do during the day and not a lot of time to do it in. I guess you could say the opportunity cost is much smaller for rich retirees, and thus they are the ones who show up to every kind of election, not just state and federal ones. So there we have it. We just shift around our election days and bam, way more participation. Problem solved, right? Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not going to argue with Professor Barry that if you put federal and local elections on the same day, you're going to get more participation in the local end of things than you would otherwise. In that sense, sure, I think we really should consider doing that to get more people involved in local decision making. But here's the thing. While the align election days does sort of solve the problem, does it actually solve the cause for why people vote in national elections but not local ones? If you say the cause is, well, it's inconvenient to go to lots of elections and easier to go to just one, so folks whose time is more in demand than rich retirees have to pick and choose, then yeah, I totally agree. But answer me this. Why is it that when the days are separated, and there are lots and lots of different election days, some federal, some local, some state, people overcome the inconvenience for the federal or state election and not the local one? By which I mean, why aren't there some people who, instead of saying, I vote in all the federal elections, but not the local ones because I can't get away from work, or that's a pain in the ass, are saying, I vote in all the local elections, but not the state or federal ones because that's a pain in the ass? If there are 10 election days in a year, which I don't think is true, but just assume for the sake of argument, and you can make it to just 2 out of those 10, why isn't that most of the time you're going to spend those days on federal and state elections instead of 2 local ones? There's no difference in hours spent between going to the polls on one day to participate in federal elections and going to the polls on one day to participate in the local ones. There's no real difference in inconvenience. So why is it that the folks whose time comes at a premium are nevertheless choosing to go on the days where the federal elections are being held and not the local ones? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It's because state and federal elections are generally perceived as somehow being more important than local elections. They're worth your time more. The perceived benefit you get from going and casting a vote in a federal election is strong enough that it is worth the cost for many people to go out and lose their working hours or their lunch to vote. In contrast, the perceived benefit for going and taking the time to vote in a local election just doesn't pencil out for most people. That's why a lot of folks aren't going out and voting in local elections, but are still making the time to go and vote in federal or state ones. They just don't seem to matter as much. And that's the thing about Barry's realignment solution. Sure, it definitely helps treat the symptoms of the different weights that people give to local elections versus federal elections. Puts a band-aid on the problem by making it so, hey, you don't have to choose between participation in state and federal and participation in local elections. You can just do all of them at the same time. But it doesn't actually get at the core problem or dynamic, that at the end of the day, local elections are devalued and seen as comparatively unimportant. That's the real cause of low local election turnout, and why the people who vote in them tend to be the people for whom participating in an election presents no real opportunity cost, so they can easily show up to the polls a lot. If we really wanted to pump participation, we'd make it so that people perceive local government as really mattering, as a worthwhile and indeed an irreplaceable opportunity for political agency, and one of the very few realms in this sometimes fucked up country where the stuff we do can still make the world a better place. Local government has to be the main attraction, not just a sideshow. Now, being my little local politics freak self, I am, of course, going to push back a little bit and say a bunch of hoity-toity shit about why, even under our current top-down system, the perception that local elections are less important than other kinds of elections is wrong, and the people who hold that belief are mistaken. I could say stuff like, oh, the quantifiable impact of your vote in a local election is super high compared to federal elections, so actually the local election matters more. Or I could say something like, the stuff that happens in your local government is far more important to your daily life than whatever the fuck the state and federal government are up to at any given time. I could talk about how, for the average square mile in America, the federal and often the state votes cast there really don't make any difference at all, and will always be outweighed by distant and more populous communities, but the opposite is true for local elections. Yada, yada, yada. You've heard me say it before, including at the beginning of this episode, and you'll probably hear me say it again. And to be clear, I do think I'm right about this. I truly believe that your local vote matters more than your state or federal one, even as things currently stand. But you know what? I can't blame people for prioritizing the federal elections over the local ones, or your gubernatorial election over your city council election. Why wouldn't you? When our whole damn political system is based on top-down preemption with the feds at the top and the state in the middle and the local governments at the bottom, why wouldn't you take the hint that it's what's at the top that matters? When we have federal leaders that do insane shit like stay in office while they have dementia or start wars in the Middle East for oil companies, and you have to show up to a federal election to try and stop that, why wouldn't you make that federal election your priority? When we are constantly bombarded with a media ecosystem that feeds off federal drama and federal bad behavior and culture war bullshit, why wouldn't you get caught up in the flow? When billions and billions and billions of dollars are pissed away on ads and celebrity guests and campaign staffers and consultants and lobbyists and all the other bullshit that's designed in a lab to keep you engaged and get you out to vote for federal politicians, well, it turns out you're more likely to vote. So while it's easy for me and other people in my position to kind of get on our high horse and say, oh man, if only people had big brains like us and were able to get local government pilled, we'd all be better off. If only folks were just enlightened enough to make the time. In reality, that's a stupid and self-aggrandizing position. Education on the importance of local government is good and can change behavior, but we are facing entire systems of power, politics, and finance that are designed to make federal elections carry weight and local elections appear relatively useless. We need systemic solutions to those systemic problems rather than blaming individuals for having a wrong-think mindset. So how do we solve this problem? How can we get out from under the weight of all this money and all this power that directs us towards hyperfixation on federal or state politics? How can we make it so that people aren't just directing more interest towards local government affairs, but are directing more interest because that interest is warranted. And the things that are happening in local government are important and meaningful in open, uncontroversial ways. How can we design a systemic solution that doesn't just replicate the disparities of the current system, one that allows for both maximum opportunity for exercise of political agency while also being responsive and realistic to the demands of life? This answer isn't going to shock anybody who has been listening for a while or who read the name of the podcast. That's right, I think that localism is the systemic solution we need to reignite engagement in local government. And I think that proxy-based direct democracy is the procedural way to make sure that localist reforms and enhanced local power is something that everybody can share rather than a privileged few. Real quick recap on what localism is. We've done a ton of episodes on this, but I love to hear myself talk, so we're going to explain it again. There's technically two forms of localism, absolute and performance localism. We have episodes on both, but let's avoid the technicalities for now and just give the general strokes. Localism takes the normal pyramid of preemption, federal is higher law than state law is higher law than local, and inverts it, making it so local laws preempt inconsistent state and federal ones rather than the other way around. The one exception is the rights guaranteed under the Constitution, which under localism, local governments would continue to have absolutely no ability to alter or diminish. Localism makes it so the level of government that is closest to you, most accountable to you, most susceptible to your agency, most understanding of the unique issues facing you and your community, also the level of government empowered to make the decisions that actually matter. It ensures that your community gets to decide for itself on the issues of our time. Bodily autonomy, taxes, education, healthcare, war, infrastructure, public spending, housing, rather than leaving that in the hands of federal or state political bodies that answer to people other than you, or giving your local government crumbs of power that can be swept away at any time. When it comes to the important stuff, the most important stuff, you should get the most say on the rules that apply in your community, your neighborhood, your home. That's not a radical proposition. And the way that we can make that a reality is to give controlling authority to your government, your local government, on what happens in your locality. That's localism. Why do these admittedly pretty dramatic reforms address voter apathy towards local government, and why would it spur people to participate in local decision-making? Here's what I think. I think if you shifted where the decision-making on all these hot-button items was happening, shifted it so that rather than watching all the decisions play out on the political theater through your phones and TV screens, got to actually go out in person and make these decisions for yourselves along with your fellow community members and watch those decisions translate into immediate changes for how things work in your community, then we would see people have a lot more investment in what is going on in the local level. Seeing your desires and preferences reflected in the law, and even better, seeing your actions translate into actual change where you live, is an incredibly invigorating experience. The whole reason I started down this path of localism is because of an experience where I helped something happen in my locality, actually went out and sweated and worked, and saw that effort translate into demonstrable change. In a time where things often feel helpless, where events are spiraling due to forces that feel distant and out of our control, having your personal, individual work translate into a tangible change is empowering. It makes you want to go out and do it again, see your efforts be rewarded. And under localism, you'll have that experience over and over again. You'll be called on to make the most consequential decisions in your community's history, and maybe even your entire life. You'll feel the triumph when the votes of you and your community members translate into a piece of monumental policy that has life-changing effects in an area you're passionate about. You'll feel the very, very sharp grief and despair and shock that comes from losing on an issue or law you really care about, realizing that the people you live with, your neighbors, friends, maybe even your family, see the world in a fundamentally different way than you, and that this thing that's happened that repulses you can't be blamed on distant bodies of people with different values or the politicking of morally bankrupt feds. No, the call is truly coming from inside the house, for better or for worse. And no matter what happens, whether these important issues are decided in ways you agree with, there will be a sense that the decision was earned. that it wasn't distant interests or big political parties or people who live hundreds or thousands of miles away in a big city telling you how you should handle business in your own backyard. No, each decision will flow directly from you and your locality. When that's the arena you're in, when all the big ticket culture items are being decided and argued on the local level, not the state or federal level, of course, people are going to get more engaged. Of course, it'll be more worth it for people to take time out of their day to participate in local political processes. They'll be drawn to it. It'll be one of the most fulfilling, scary, and intoxicating parts of their lives. Turning off the purple prose hose for just a moment, here's my case in plainer language. Why do people expend the time and effort to vote in federal elections but not in local ones? Because the federal ones just seem more important. So to make people participate more in local elections, you need to shift that perspective to make local elections seem like the ones that are the most important. And localism enables that shift in perspective by making your local governments have more power and giving people a chance to participate directly in governance themselves. I bet you dollars to donuts that in an America that had embraced localism, we'd see participation in local politics and potentially local elections skyrocket. Now, if we just turn the pyramid of preemption upside down in the way that localism prescribes, I think we'd be in a better place than we were before. But we also would have created a new playing field for all those corporate and political and cultural influences that drive federal decision making. If the feds are declawed, then all those same guns are going to be brought to bear against local government. Sure, that might not be as effective. It's much harder to try and get hundreds and hundreds of localities on your side than it is to pay some lobbyist to hobnob with politicians in a single capital city so that you can pass one federal law that binds everybody. It's probably going to be harder to rig stuff when communities get to say for themselves who their politicians are, but we'd be naive to think that local governments are fonts of perfect public responsibility and are never corrupt or compromised by national political influences. Of course they are. And that's why, at least in my view, we can't just upend the flow of preemption and call it a day. We then have to take the extra step of making these newly empowered local governments be governed by true direct democracy. No elected officials, no stupid gamesmanship, just you and your community members passing laws and making decisions for yourselves, rather than hoping some career politician makes good on their election promises. Direct democracy promises both to ensure that local government truly represents the will of your community and also dismantle the structures of entrenched party politicking that have so badly damaged our country and our society. And here's the thing about direct democracy. Turns out that it's actually logistically and interpersonally really hard to expect literally every single citizen to go to every single town meeting and legislative session to cast a vote. And if you do run direct democracy this way, by which I mean if you just say, okay, we're counting the votes of anybody who happens to be at this meeting today, and whichever side has the most votes wins, guess what you've just done? That's right. You've empowered the people who have the most time and capacity to darken the doorstep of City Hall every night, to be at every legislative session, to attend all events in person to cast their vote. In other words, all you've done after all this effort to reverse the flow of preemption and then implement direct democracy is empower exactly the same people who were empowered by the prior system. Richer and older retirees who now can reign supreme because they can sit in these city council meetings all day. And average working people are going to get shafted because they don't have a ton of time on their hands to sit and listen to everybody argue and debate. They have to go to work and take care of their kids. And aside from those folks, what about the very elderly who don't move around so well and have trouble accessing a city council building or driving to get there? What about someone with a physical disability who literally can't sit in hours-long meetings? If you happen to live right next to City Hall in what is likely one of the more expensive parts of town, and going to a city event is as easy as strolling out your front door and walking across the street, it's going to be way easier for you to exercise your political power in a directly democratic system than it will be for someone who lives further away and might not have the money for a car, might not have the time to drive. You might think, well, direct democracy is all about assuming that everyone's vote should be equal. So a system that seems to lift up the votes of others by making their participation more easy and suppress the votes of others by making their participation more difficult seems unfair. And you'd be right. Which is why localism isn't just for direct democracy. It's specifically for proxy-based direct democracy, a system that very slightly tweaks ordinary direct democracy to capture the convenience benefits of small R republicanism while avoiding republicanism's pitfalls. Here's how it works. To repeat what is apparently my favorite line from this episode, we have already done a past show on proxy-based direct democracy, so I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty, and instead, we'll just try to give you the gist. In direct democracy, everything works on a very simple principle. One person, one vote. Whatever law or appointee or decision gets the most votes wins. Proxy-based direct democracy still operates on those exact same principles. One person, one vote, majority wins. The difference is that rather than having to be there in person to exercise that one vote, you also have the option to delegate that vote to a trusted person to wield on your behalf. This delegation is purely optional, and it also can be removed by you at any time within reason. Maybe you need to give 2 weeks notice or something. And for any reason. This isn't like an election where you are permanently putting someone in place and only get the chance to send them packing once every few years. This delegation of your vote to another person is a limited handoff to one person that you can reverse at any time. This person you're handing your vote off to is called your proxy, thus the name proxy-based direct democracy. Once you've delegated your vote, your proxy's vote then counts 2 times, once for the proxy's own vote and once for your delegated vote. More than one person can, if those people wish, delegate their votes to the same proxy, and that proxy's vote counts for the number of delegated votes plus 1, the proxy's own vote. You're never required to delegate. Appointing a proxy is purely a voluntary decision, and as mentioned, you can always take back your proxy delegation at any time. The result is a system where it's still one person, one vote, but you aren't disenfranchised if you don't have the time or effort or frankly the interest to sit in city council meetings all day. The proxy system offers flexibility. Give your vote to your buddy who is a local politics freak for them to handle the day-to-day stuff, then take it back for the exciting stuff you want to be involved in yourself or that you don't trust your buddy to represent your interests on. This system is a little bit complicated to explain and it can seem a little bit out there, but I think the best way to understand what I'm trying to go for here is just to consider an everyday example. Let's say that you and your significant other live in an apartment building. And it happens to be an apartment building that, for better or worse, is right across the street from the apartment building in which your sister lives. Now, you are kind of a local politics person. You maybe go to city council meetings 2 or 3 times a year if it's stuff that is really a hot button item or has to do specifically with the area where you live or your neighborhood. On the other hand, your sister is a local politics nerd. She's in there all the time. She works a kind of job where she can work odd hours, and that enables her to go to a lot of city council meetings in person. And most importantly, you really trust your sister when it comes to how she thinks about things. You often turn to her for guidance and discussion when you're trying to figure out what issue or what political appointee you should support. You guys don't agree all the time, but you respect your sister and you trust her to vote most of the time in a way that's consistent with your values and preferences. So here's what you do. You sit down and you tell your sister, hey, I don't want to be in these city council meetings all the time, or I guess it's not city council, it'd be like the city popular assembly at this point. And I know that you'll do a good job of doing what's right. I'm going to delegate you my vote. I'm going to make you my proxy. However, I see that in 2 months there's going to be this item on the docket that has to do with approving a building right across the way that I really, really support. And I know that you and I have sometimes disagreed about whether or not city council should be putting those kinds of buildings in our neighborhood. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you my proxy for now, but then in 3 weeks, I'm going to withdraw the proxy delegation for a couple of weeks so I can go out and vote for that one issue that I care about. And when that's over, you can have it back. And your sister goes, oh, okay, sure. Hey, can you do me a favor? I'm actually going out of town next month, and there's something on the calendar that I think you probably don't feel super strongly about, but I do. Could I delegate you to be my proxy so you can go to that city council meeting, and then after that I can take my proxy delegation back? And you go, oh, okay, yeah, sure, that's no problem. And this kind of sitting down and hashing things out, being very practical about who can be where when, understanding that you can trust each other on some things but not on others, knowing that together you can make sure that there's somebody who's sitting down for most of the stuff that happens in the local government, that's what proxy-based direct democracy is all about. Whether it's a grandma giving her vote to her grandson, who she knows is younger and stronger and more able to stay up late at all these crazy council discussions and debates. Whether it's you giving your wife your proxy vote because you know that she's going to go out and do a great job on your behalf, but then taking it back when it comes to a contentious issue that the two of you don't agree on. These are the kinds of things that make it so proxy-based direct democracy still reflects your values and preferences, still is operating on that one person, one vote basis, but is providing you the convenience and security of knowing that even if you don't have the time or the capacity or frankly the interest to pay all that much attention to local politics, your voice is still going to be heard and your interests are still going to be represented. And that's all for today. We covered some pretty good ground by identifying who currently votes in local elections, how that warps local politics, how localism can drive greater engagement in local government, and how proxy-based direct democracy helps localism avoid recreating the flaws of the current small R Republican system, while also providing a benefit to the community as a whole by ensuring that everybody's voices are heard, and those who might not care all that much about local government still have a way to ensure that they're participating in directly democratic processes. Next time we'll be discussing, well, I actually don't know yet. This is one of those rare times where I don't have anything specific lined up for the next episode. So I guess we'll both be surprised when next we speak. If that mystery box of an episode sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again that's localist with a T, pod at gmail.com. You're also welcome to submit a question or comment via the form on www.localistpod.net. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.